everybody. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Core. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society, and welcome to our session of Tennessee 101, the history of music in Tennessee. We have one more session left in this series, which will be next month in April. We're going to have sort of a panel discussion on the music of Gil Scott-Heron. A lot of people don't realize that he actually spent his formative years in Jackson, Tennessee. And so we're going to have a panel that includes his biographer and some childhood friends and some bandmates. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. To register for that or any of our other online programs, go to our website, tennesseehistory.org, and then navigate to the programs page. And then you'll find different pages for each of the webinars. If you've missed one, you can go back and watch a recording. Those are on the pages with that particular session. So if you just look down at the bottom, you'll see the video there. In tonight's session, if you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the Q&A box and we'll discuss them after the presentation. And do follow us on social media. It's the best way to learn about upcoming programs, and there are all of our handles there. We do want to thank our sponsors for this, Humanities Tennessee and the Tennessee Arts Commission. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring this programs to you. So thank you to our major funders. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Langston Wilkins, who's the co-convener of this series. Langston is on faculty at the University of, where are you, Langston? University of Wisconsin-Madison. I know where you are. My mind just went blank. But he did spend many years in Tennessee doing field work with all sorts of artists and craftspeople and practitioners across the state. So Langston, you're going to introduce us to this particular, you're going to introduce us to Sean, okay?
Yep. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Sean Pitts, who is my co-convener of this series. Dr. Pitts is a founding director of Arts at McNary. He's a scholar, a writer, and arts advocate based in Selmer, Tennessee. He's been active researching and writing about the traditional culture of West Tennessee for more than 20 years. His writings have appeared in Southern Cultures, The Daily Yonder, The Bitter Southerner, and many other periodicals and publications. In 2019, he co-produced and wrote liner notes for the Bear Family Records release, Discovering Carl Perkins, Eastview, Tennessee, 1952 to 53. He's also served on the boards of the Tennessee Arts Commission, Humanities Tennessee, the Tennessee Folklore Society, and many other organizations. And in his spare time, he's a chiropractor based in Selmer. And so I want to welcome my friend and fellow folklorist, Sean Pitts.
Thanks, Langston. It's a pleasure to be here as always. We're getting close to the end of this series, but this is one that I look forward to a great deal. This is a really timely topic, so I'm I'm pleased to present or to introduce the presenter this evening. Amanda Marie Martinez is a historian and postdoctoral fellow in the Department of American Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. Her writings appeared in California History, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, NPR, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. Her book project, which she'll be discussing this evening, is currently under review with UNC Press, and it's a history of country music business in the post-civil rights era. And we're delighted to have Amanda with us, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks Langston for the invitation. Thanks Sean for that bio, and thanks to Jennifer and Nikki for helping coordinate as well. Let's go ahead and share my screen. All right, so thanks again to everyone for coordinating and the invitation. It's a privilege to be with you all here tonight to talk about my book project, which is tentatively called Gone Country: How Nashville Transformed a Music Genre into a Lifestyle Brand. Now, I want to begin by talking about a couple of the kind of overarching key questions of my project. So, number one, why do we still think of country music as white music? This is really a cyclical conversation. It's one we're having right now as Beyonce has released her 2 new singles, one of which, Texas Hold'em, is or has been or is being played on country radio. Again, we're having this conversation about, the Black presence that has always been there in country music. But really, we're left with this question of, why do we still think of country music as white music when it really never has been? So that is really the guiding question of my project. And that really gets me to the second kind of key question, overarching theme here, which is breaking down the difference between country music as a music genre, which is really a nebulous kind of art form that has always been impossible to define. People have debated what is or isn't country music since it has existed, right? It's existed for the last 100 years as a marketing category. Right? So the difference between country music as a kind of nebulous art form and country music as a business, as an industry, right? So I'm going to get into a lot more detail about making that distinction, right, between the genre, the art, and the business, the industry. So I'm going to start by giving really an overview of my larger project, a kind of synopsis, and then I'm going to break down how I'm defining what I'm talking about, breaking down a brief history of the country music industry, and then I'm going to get into a kind of case study that I think really gets into the main argument of my project. So my book project, again, tentatively called Gone Country, How Nashville Transformed a Music Genre into a Lifestyle Brand, is a history of the country music business in the post-civil rights era, or in other words, in the post-1968 era. And I argue that country music's commercial triumphs during this period were built on anti-Blackness and country music's positioning, its marketing, as really antithetical to youth culture, right? In opposition to youth culture, which often functions as a synonym for subversive politics and or Black culture, especially when we're talking about popular music, right? Usually when we think about popular music, we're thinking of it as a sort of youth culture. And I argue that country music has served this space within commercial music where it's really been catered to a kind of adult demographic, right? Not youth oriented. So I look at music industry archives and artist and fan testimonials to show how major figures in the Nashville-based country music business really crafted this myth of a purely white subculture, while also being aware of and ignoring or kind of overlooking Black and Latinx artists and fans. So I focus on the period of the late 1960s to 9/11, and I argue that country music operated during this period not primarily as a type of music, but as a tool of white grievance, alongside the early rise of country's first Black star, Charlie Pride, during the Reagan years and in a post-Rodney King America. So as I began research on this project, one of the first challenges I encountered was learning how to navigate the different narratives that I came across when I was looking at this archival material. So things or materials produced by the country music industry often presented a very different image of who and what constituted country music, that when compared to other sources coming from fans or up-and-coming artists, for instance. So as one example, when I began researching my chapter on the 1970s, I started by looking at this publication called CMA Close-Up. So this is the monthly newsletter of the Country Music Association, or the CMA, which is the trade organization for members of the country music business. So when I looked at these monthly updates throughout the 1970s, one example of what you see on the left here, I was left bored, right? What would I write about? It really gave the suggestion that not a lot was happening in country music at the time. But then I turned to another publication coming out of Nashville at the same time called Music City News, which you see here on the right. So this was a music magazine which covered music news around Nashville at the time, and it was directed at both fans and people in the industry. But what a difference. So when I looked at Music City News, on the other hand, I found this thoroughly fascinating story about country music. And I found that its racial and political definitions were hotly contested, right? And among many things, I couldn't believe the amount of ads that I encountered advertising Black women trying to break into country music. So this is what you see on the right here. So, and notice that these artists are being advertised as country artists, right? Not soul artists, not R&B, that you might typically associate a Black artist with. They are being advertised as country artists. So this experience, these countering narratives, made me realize the need to make a key distinction when talking about country music and talking about my project, which is to spell out the difference between country music, the nebulous art form that has always been impossible to define, and country music, the business, country music, the marketing category. Over the past century, the country music industry has increasingly centralized in one place, which of course is Nashville. And by the 50s and the 60s, it came to hold a near monopoly. I mean, of course, rivaled by Capitol in Los Angeles, but for the most part, dominated the producing and recording of country music, which really gave this business unique power in dictating who and what defined country music. And this has really made country music as a genre unique, right? There isn't any other type of music that has this kind of power structure behind it, right? That's existed this long and is this centralized and has only gotten more powerful over time. And it's really this power structure that is my focus, as I'm interested in how these gatekeepers in Nashville have worked to maintain country's racial parameters over time, really in the name of good business strategy, as I think they would argue. So in analyzing country music, the marketing category, I want to highlight how it was first invented by the music business, because I frame country music as just that, an invention of the music business. So despite the genre's multiracial roots, what we now refer to as country music has always been marketed with only a white audience in mind. When it was first invented as a marketing category in the 1920s, it was sold as hillbilly and old-time music and was associated with a white, rural, and Southern audience. This category was established alongside the creation of race records, which was designated for Black artists and consumers. The artificial separation of these categories did not reflect how musicians and fans often enjoyed music in practice. Instead, it was a testament to the era of Jim Crow segregation that dictated life in the early 20th century South. Music executives did not permit artists to record songs that they identified as hillbilly or old time, which whitewashed the presence of Black fiddlers and banjo players, even in spite of the latter instrument's African roots. And of course, artists today like Rhiannon Giddens and Don Flemons are reclaiming this history. So over time, Nashville became the undisputed center of the country music business, and we can view the start of this process with the Grand Ole Opry, a radio show that first aired out of Nashville in 1925. And as this power structure grew, no force would prove more influential than the Country Music Association, better known as the CMA, which was started in 1958 as a trade organization for members of the country music business. Since then, the CMA has propelled the growth of country music and can be credited with fueling the massive growth of all country radio stations in the 1960s and beyond. The CMA also helped found things like the Country Music Hall of Fame, which serves as a canon for country music legends and history. But the CMA is probably best known for the CMA Awards, which air nationally each fall and really serves as the biggest PR event for country music each year. So overall, my general point is that the makeup of this power structure has really made country music unique. Country music is equipped with these gatekeepers who continually wield power in defining who and what constitutes country music. So as Nashville's power structure came of age in the 1950s, a primary concern for the business was convincing the broader public, and especially radio advertisers, that country music, and more importantly, its listeners, were respectable, and not the poor white people that were first associated with the music from the start. So if we look at this example from on the left here, this is an article from Variety magazine in 1926. You can get a sense for the kind of classist discriminations that were lodged at what was then called hillbilly music and its listeners, right? So among other things, it's identifying these listeners as illiterate and ignorant with the intelligence of morons. But over time, you're seeing that what we now have come to call country music has continued to grapple with its class politics, right? And this question of, has it kind of shed its lowbrow whiteness in a sense, right? 1954, there's this article saying hillbilly music leaves the hills. By 1971, this magazine cover is saying that country music is hillbilly no more. So in each case, it's very clear that country music's class politics are a very big part of how we've thought of the music over time. But as marketing research became more prevalent throughout the 1960s and beyond, the country music business worked diligently to show that country listeners had money and they spent it. Implicit in this process was that country listeners were white. And as such, I'll note that these listeners, if we're thinking about the 1960s, were among the biggest beneficiaries of post-World War II affluence, who experienced broad social mobility at this time. In following decades, when evidence emerged about non-white listeners, I argue the business believed they had no financial incentive to highlight the presence of these listeners because they already found these class politics to be the main hurdle of concern in their view, I would argue. But by the 1990s, I show how country music really overcame its class concerns in new ways. Between 1989 and 1994, country record sales quadrupled. And at its peak, and at the peak of country music's popularity during this time, in 1994, nearly 42% of all Americans were regularly listening to country music on the radio. As country sales soared to new heights, the music was at least no longer principally interpreted as the music of lower class whites, but instead identified as the soundtrack of middle-aged white suburbanites. But for all the fanfare surrounding country music's new commercial heights, racial tensions within country music also defined this period. Some, like this New York Times article, questioned whether the genre might have become too white, going so far as to call it a soundtrack of white flight. So I'm now going to turn to a definitive moment for the country music industry in the 1990s, when its racial and class politics came to a head. During this period, I show how country music didn't function as a type of music, but really as an extension of its targeted audience. As one journalist described it at the time, country music was, quote, not angry at the world, just oblivious to it. So I'm now going to take us to Los Angeles on the evening of April 29th, 1992. And on this evening, the Academy of Country Music Awards, also or better known as the ACM Awards, were held in Los Angeles. And that evening, Garth Brooks, country's biggest star at the time, took home the most prized award of the night for Entertainer of the Year. But earlier that day, just north of Los Angeles, in Simi Valley, the 4 officers involved in the brutal beating of Rodney King were acquitted of wrongdoing, leading to 6 days of uprisings in the city and building on existing tensions that followed the murder of Latasha Harlins, a young Black woman who was just 15 when she was killed by a convenience store owner who'd accused her of stealing a bottle of orange juice and later got off with just 5 years probation for the murder. As the ACM Awards ended, it meant that the country music business got an up-close look at the uprisings as they began. As Brooks later recalled, that night that the riots hit, we watched it all on a TV on the bus leaving LA. And as you drove out of LA, you could see the buildings on fire. It was pretty scary for all of us, especially a bunch of guys from Oklahoma. So in processing that evening's events, Brooks went on to write a song called We Shall Be Free, which was released in October of that year. And it was really a song encouraging tolerance and love for everyone, regardless of social status. So I'll share with you some of the lyrics from the song. I'm not able to play the song, but the main point really is the lyrics. So here you see he sings, when the last child cries for a crust of bread, when the last man dies for just words that he said, when there's shelter over the poorest head, then we shall be free. When the last thing we notice is the color of skin, and when the first thing we look for is the beauty within, when the skies and the oceans are clean again, then we shall be free. So despite Brooks's well intentions for the song, its optimism, its oversimplification of race relations ended up proving a bit tone deaf for the moment. By the 1990s, country music's associations with whiteness and conservatism complicated well-meaning, albeit I think idealistic, calls for colorblindness from the genre. And the head of Brooks's record label, who you see with him here, Jimmy Bowen, later chastised the singer for releasing the track, saying it sounded like warmed over protest music from the late 60s and early 70s, explaining people tried to make him understand it wasn't the time in the world to be putting out a We Shall Be Free. It might have been too liberal for country's demographics, or too simplistic and idealistic for America after the social and racial upheaval of the riots. I want to also highlight another artist in attendance at the ACM Awards that night back in April 1992, who had a very different reaction to that evening's events. To Cleve Francis, who you see here, who was the only contemporary Black artist signed to a major label at the time, the uprisings didn't signal the need for calls for unity, but instead confirmed dashed hopes for his acceptance within the exclusively white country music business. As he later recalled, in 1992, I was at the ACM Awards, and on television was the riots in LA, and it was Rodney King. I thought really in the 1990s that the country was ready for a Black country artist, but obviously they weren't. I bring up this story in the conflict that it reveals over what country music signified in the popular imagination to highlight the main argument of my project, which is that country music by this period did not represent a sound, but rather a type of music marketed to a specific consumer. In this case, white, conservative, middle-income adults who do not identify with youth culture. As a consumer product, it wasn't supposed to challenge white supremacy, but rather reinforce it. This is something that Jimmy Bowen recognized in discouraging the release of We Shall Be Free, and it's something that Cleve Francis came to recognize as a Black man in country music. Despite being the biggest star in the genre, And despite a fledgling effort to position the music otherwise, not even Garth Brooks had the power to counter country's associations with white supremacy. As you can imagine, We Shall Be Free turned out to be a bit of a commercial flop for Brooks, if you compare it to his previous string of record-breaking chart success. But in that regard, it proved to be an outlier for both Garth Brooks and the country music business on the whole. At the time, country music had never been more commercially successful. In 1991, country music became the most popular format programmed on radio stations in the US. Major magazines like Time and Forbes reported on country's new heights. This Time cover story reported on the rise of country music with the headline, within the article, the headline was "Country Rocks the Boomers," saying the nation's 76 million baby boomers continue to determine America's music preferences, and what America currently prefers is country. So to the country music business, I think that the affluence combined with the sheer number of baby boomers made these listeners an especially attractive and coveted audience. And as Time reported on how country music had become the music of choice for baby boomers, the CMA was eager to put forth the same image of who the country music consumer is. Here's an example where the typical CMA awards viewer here is identified as among the following. So here you can look at this image where they gathered market research and claim that the typical CMA awards viewer was someone like a female between the ages of 25 and 30 who lives in a household of 4, wears eyeglasses, uses mascara, owns a cat, spent $94 on a cocktail dress, invested in the stock market, etc. But my general point here is that these images of who the country music consumer was differed greatly from the original poor and rural whites who were first associated with the music. And of course, the CMA was eager to present evidence showing that country music had achieved full class mobility into the mainstream. Market research elsewhere by the CMA, radio stations, record labels, further pushed this image of the country music listener as not only middle class and suburban, but as mostly women. Because women are the consumers most desirable to advertisers, identifying the quintessential country listener as women further helped strengthen country music's dominance on radio. By the 1990s, the prevalence of attractive male stars like Billy Ray Cyrus and George Strait, among many others, was evidence of the industry's efforts to target women listeners. And I think, I think a lot of us maybe live in Nashville, are familiar with it. If you look at the prevalence of bachelorette parties, I think that that's evidence of country music's continued interest in these women, white women listeners. A report from the 1992 CMA Fanfare spoke to the abundance of these female fans, saying, quote, "Those who have doubts about whether country music dollars are female driven had only to listen to the squeals each time a male artist turned around." Tim Dubois, head of Arista Records, echoed this preference for women listeners, saying most of the dollars are female dollars, both ticket sales and record sales. And the same old strategy works, that to get the females out, you give them the good-looking guy who sounds great. So from a business perspective, the industry really had little incentive to deviate from its associations with this white affluent audience. These were precisely the type of consumers advertisers most desired, which was the principal goal for the country music business for several decades by this point, to make its product attractive to advertisers. The New York Times reported on the genre's listeners in 1990, noting that a once predominantly rural working class demographic had now firmly suburbanized, saying the music, quote, "purveys pop escapism in spiffy rented cowboy garb for an audience that has expanded into the suburbs," adding, "The only thing in country that hasn't changed is its complexion." But during this period, no one challenged country music's racial understandings more than Cleve Francis. In 1992, he became the first Black country artist signed to a major label in roughly a generation. The singer's race wasn't the only thing that set him apart in Nashville. Francis was a well-respected cardiologist living in Mount Vernon, Virginia, when his country music career unexpectedly launched. Dubbed the country music doctor, Francis was given an extraordinarily rare and concerted promotional push by a major record label for a Black country artist. In many ways, Francis was initially given ample reason to be optimistic about his music career. Despite concerns about his race in the eyes of listeners, he explained, "The fans don't mind. I've got rooms full of letters to prove it." He remained hopeful his presence in country music would continue to be accepted, saying, "This is 1992, and it's inconceivable to me that someone would hear a record and decide not to play it because I was Black." As Francis earned a string of small hits on the country music charts, questions arose about the presence of Black country listeners and why they were understood to be so unusual. Growing evidence showed they were anything but atypical. And parallel evidence also emerged at this time surrounding Latinx listeners as well. But at a time when country music had never been more popular, studies by Simmons Market Research revealed as much as a quarter of all Black adult listeners listened to country music on the radio on a weekly basis. So to Francis, the statistics on Black listeners provided all the evidence the industry needed to seriously consider and cater to a Black demographic. As part of a larger effort to push the business to reach out to Black listeners, he published a piece in Billboard in 1995 called "Country and Black Listeners, Not an Oxymoron," urging the industry to reach out to these fans, saying, "I challenge the industry to do the marketing research necessary to take full economic and artistic advantage of this growing group of country music lovers." But despite Francis's well-founded efforts to convince the broader industry to diversify racially, his appeals often fell on deaf ears within a business that had never, in its 7 decades, been pressed to consider prioritizing racial diversity. By the second half of the 1990s, the prospects of creating racial diversity within country music came to an abrupt halt on the part of the industry. Francis was dropped from his record label after his 1994 album failed to chart well. Reflecting on his inability to achieve sustained commercial success in country music, Francis mused his limited success was due to an insufficient embrace from the music industry. It was a matter of the business proving unwilling to accept him as a Black artist. Despite earlier optimism, Francis concluded race did play a very significant role in me not making it, citing a lack of radio airplay as key to his commercial failure. And in the process, he explained, the industry was making the listeners look poorly by presuming they would not accept a Black artist. As he explained, the industry is playing the people cheap. They're portraying the white country music audience as a bunch of bigots that don't like Black people or would be uncomfortable with a Black artist. It isn't true. It's giving a bad message as we come into the 21st century that this is the only segregated music form we still have. Though Francis understood his music career in Nashville had to come to an end, he nevertheless found it essential to help mobilize a community of Black country artists for the future. "I just feel like God gave me this talent to sing, and I should have had a better shot at it," he explained. "I hope these kids get a better shot, but until the attitudes change about the music, it won't happen." Francis started the Black Country Music Association in 1995 to create community for Black country artists. In creating the BCMA, Francis leaned on the precedent of his medical career. Like country music, the field of cardiology was also almost exclusively white when he began his career in the 1980s. When he wasn't able to find a job, he started his own medical practice. Given this experience, Francis told me he leaned into the same reasoning with country music, saying, "Maybe Black people need to not keep trying to knock on the door in this industry. And we need to start our own industry." Adding, "I thought if Black artists could come up with sponsors, then we could get money and set up our own thing. To Francis, it was also imperative to educate the country music community about the constant and essential presence of Black musicians and fans in country music's history. According to the singer, country music was in jeopardy of becoming a genre forever defined by whiteness without conscious, sustained action to remember its multiracial roots. It's so far out there, it's almost the truth, he said, referring to the idea that country only appealed to white people. If you let it become the truth, you're in trouble. It's based on erroneous conclusions someone reached, and the industry is marketing based on those 1920s erroneous assumptions. Francis called on the industry to act, saying it was perhaps the last chance this industry has of keeping an antiquated assumption that country music is created only by white people for other white people. Now, over the past few years, especially since 2020, racial tensions have emerged and been discussed within the country music business like never before. Most recently, of course, Beyonce has dominated conversations about race in country music, as she even earned a #1 hit on the Hot Country Songs Billboard chart. But it remains to be seen whether Beyonce's presence on country radio will make the format more open to playing artists of color in the future. So far, there's not indication that the singles have challenged the system and its goal of targeting affluent white listeners. As one country radio programmer recently told Variety, the core country audience is still that 35 to 45-year-old soccer mom. And they don't just listen to country, they listen to pop, where Beyonce has had a huge impact. So why wouldn't it work? Still, a generation after the Black Country Music Association was created, Black country artists and fans continue to push for recognition and sustainable careers, even if it means building new platforms to do so. In 2020, singer Reese Palmer created the radio show Color Me Country to promote the music of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous country artists. And the show is named for the 1970 album by Linda Martell, the first Black woman to earn a hit on the country music charts. And Martell's granddaughter, Kia Thompson, is working on a documentary about her grandmother. In 2021, a country music fan named Holly G, who you see on the left here, founded the Black Opry for Black country artists and fans. And you see here Holly G with Frankie Staten, one of the original members of the Black Country Music Association who oversaw the BCMA in its early years. And over the past few years since the Black Opry has launched, they have also created a record label, Black Opry Records. So whether or not this moment with Beyonce changes future programming at country radio, it's clear Beyonce's foray into country music has helped shed light on the presence of Black country artists. Artists like tenor Adele, whose song Buckle Bunny includes the lyric "looking like Beyonce with the lasso," have noted the profile boost that Beyonce's new singles have given them, revealing the strong demand still for Black country artists and a growing community of Black country fans who will continue to build and broaden legacies of Black country music. Thank you so much for listening.